She said she was late for yoga. I didn't ask any questions. She had always been a fitness enthusiast, and I saw no reason to doubt her. And then I happened to meet Kelly, her friend, with whom she seemed to go to these classes together. "How's your yoga?" I asked her casually. Kelly raised her eyebrows. I haven't been to yoga with her in months. "She didn't tell you?" I didn't say anything, just nodded. The next night, Laura said she was going to yoga again. I decided to check it out. The club where she was supposed to be practicing was practically empty. "Yoga?" the girl at the reception asked. "We haven't had these classes for months." I thanked her and went outside. She returned home around 9, mat in hand, as usual. "How was yoga?" I asked, not taking my eyes off the TV. "Good," she nodded, taking off her jacket. I didn't answer. For a few days, I just watched. She became more attentive to the phone. She started having extra classes on weekends. On Friday, she said she was staying at a group class until late in the evening. I came home early and started packing. She came back late. "How was the class?" I smiled from the kitchen table. "It was good. We worked on breathing techniques." I nodded and handed her the folder with the documents. "I think you can practice your breathing alone now." She froze, looking at the divorce papers. I stood up, took my suitcase and silently walked out the door. Max, our dog, followed me. He didn't ask any questions either. The next few days passed in silence. I rented a small house outside the city where I could be alone. Max lay by the door and watched me unpack. The phone was silent. Laura tried to call for the first 2 days, but I ignored her. Then there was silence. I thought it was the end. But it wasn't. A week later, I went to a local coffee shop for coffee. Max was waiting at the entrance. "Nick?" I turned around. Tom, a mutual friend, was standing in front of me. "Oh, hi," I said, trying to pretend that everything was fine. "How are you?" "I heard." "Well, you know." I nodded. "I'm fine. Still getting used to it." Tom paused as if he was about to say something. I saw Laura at the bar last night." I raised an eyebrow. "She wasn't alone. She was with that guy." I didn't have to ask who. I wasn't surprised. Tom shrugged guiltily. "I'm sorry I said that. I just thought you should know." "It's okay, Tom. Thanks." I walked out of the store and called Max. That evening I sat on the porch looking out over the lake. Max lay down next to me with his head in my lap. The phone vibrated again. "Hi. Can we talk?" It was a message from Laura. I looked at the screen for a long time before answering. "What about?" "We've already said everything." The answer came quickly. "I didn't mean for it to end like this. I'm sorry." Max looked up, as if sensing that I was nervous. I deleted the message. Really, everything had already been said. The next morning I went for a run with Max. The sun was rising over the lake, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe easier. Laura's betrayal no longer seemed like something that defined my life. The days flowed into one another, and I gradually got used to my new life. Max became my constant companion. We walked along the lake every evening, and on weekends I took him fishing. Laura didn't write anymore. Sometimes I caught myself thinking that I was waiting for that message or call. But with each passing day, this feeling was weakening. One night I stayed at a local bar longer than usual. Tom was sitting next to me telling stories from his youth when the door opened. I didn't even look up until I heard a familiar voice. "Nick?" Laura was standing at the counter, looking directly at me. She looked good, better than I expected. "Laura," I nodded and took a sip of beer. Tom immediately felt the tension and found an excuse to disappear. Laura took his place. "How are you?" "I'm fine. And you? She was a little nervous, playing with her napkin. Not bad. There was a silence between us. What are you doing here, Laura? She looked at me and sighed. I wanted to talk to you. I nodded, giving her a chance to continue. I know that after what happened, I have no right to ask for anything. But I don't think we're done. We are, I said calmly. She looked confused. Don't you want to know why I did it? No. It was the truth. I wasn't looking for answers anymore. Laura looked away from the window. I thought you were going to hate me. Maybe I did for the first few days. But then I realized it was pointless. She looked at me in surprise. And now what? I finished my beer and put the glass on the counter. Now I just move on with my life, Laura. She nodded as if she finally understood. I'm glad you're happy. I didn't answer, just stood up, called Max, and started to walk out. Laura remained sitting at the bar. When I stepped out into the cool evening air, I felt better. Max walked beside me, his tail wagging. Ready to go home, buddy? He barked as if to say yes. And this time I didn't look back. The next morning I woke up feeling as if something had moved. The sun was breaking through the curtains, and Max was already sitting by the door, eagerly waiting to go for a walk. Okay, let's go, I said, pulling on my jacket. We went out to the lake, and the fresh air immediately cleared my head. Max jumped happily on the grass, and I followed, thinking about yesterday's meeting with Laura. She no longer occupied my thoughts as much as before. And that was a good thing. That afternoon, I stopped by Emma's bakery, just to have a coffee and a little chat. Oh, hey, Nick, she said when I walked in, I haven't seen you in a while. Yeah, I decided to take some time to be quiet, I replied, sitting down at a table. Emma put a cup of coffee in front of me and leaned closer. I heard Laura was back in town. I heard. And how are you? I smiled. I'm fine. She looked at me carefully, as if assessing whether I was telling the truth. I advise you not to go back, Nick. Some people don't change. And I'm not going to. Emma nodded, satisfied with the answer. In the evening I was sitting in the workshop, finishing the countertop, when I heard someone knocking softly on the door. I opened the door and saw Sophie. Hi, she said, smiling slightly. Hi. I didn't expect to see you so late. I was passing by and saw the light on. I thought I'd come in and say hi. She walked inside, looking around. Is this where you hide from the world? Something like that. Sophie sat down on a chair and looked at me carefully. You look good. And you always know how to make me feel better, I joked. She laughed, but then became more serious. Emma said Laura was back. I shrugged my shoulders. Yes, we ran into each other at the bar. But that doesn't change anything. Sophie nodded, as if expecting this answer. Good. We sat in silence while Max spun around at her feet. Maybe we can have coffee together sometime, not here, she asked, looking up. Why not? I replied. Sophie smiled and stood up. Then we agreed. She left, and I stood by the door for a long time, watching her disappear around the corner. This time, I felt that everything was really starting from scratch. And it was the right direction. The next few days passed in the usual rhythm. Sophie didn't text or check in, but it didn't seem strange. She was always a bit unpredictable, appearing at the most unexpected moments. I continued to work in the workshop, stopping by Emma's bakery from time to time. One day, as I was fixing a shelf in the back of the workshop, I heard the door open. Nick? I immediately recognized Sophie's voice. She was here. She came in holding 2 cups of coffee. I thought you might need a break. I was right. Sophie handed me the coffee and sat down on the bench next to my desk. You're working again. You know me. She was silent for a while, looking at the shelves with my products. Emma told me you've been getting a lot of orders. Yes, I have a lot of work. Sophie smiled. That's good. You deserve it. I took a sip of coffee and felt the warmth spread through my body. And you? How are your drawings going? I work a little at home. I think I'll start a new series soon. What are you going to paint? Sophie looked at me and smiled. Maybe something from this studio. Max lay down at her feet, looking at us as if he understood everything. He seemed to agree. Sophie bent down and patted the dog's head. He's always so serious. It's just an appearance, I said with a wink. We sat in silence for a while longer, just enjoying the moment. When she got up to leave, I held her hand. Sophie, what about dinner? She stopped and looked at me carefully. Are you serious? Yes. I think it's a good idea. She thought for a second and then nodded. Okay. Saturday then. It was a deal. Sophie walked out, and I stayed by the door, watching her go. Saturday was cool but clear. I waited for Sophie near an old restaurant on the outskirts of town. Max stayed at home, although he looked at me with an expression as if he wanted to go too. Sophie arrived at 7 sharp. She got out of the car, straightening her coat, and waved at me. I hope I'm not late, she said. On the contrary. I even thought you would come earlier. We went inside. The atmosphere was cozy, the fireplace was burning in the far corner, and the smell of freshly baked bread was spreading throughout the room. The waiter led us to a table by the window. Sophie took off her coat and sat down, looking around the room. I haven't been here for a long time. It's like this place has stood still in time. That's why I suggested we have dinner here. She smiled, meeting my eyes. Do you always choose places so thoughtfully? Only when it's important. She was a little embarrassed, but I could see that she liked it. Dinner was easy. We talked about work, summer plans, and even a little bit about the past. Sophie told me that she had once dreamed of opening her own gallery, but she wasn't sure if she could. And now? I asked as we finished our coffee. She looked out the window and answered quietly. Now I think anything is possible. I wanted to add something, but she changed the subject. What about you? What's next for you? I said, I don't know. Right now I like life the way it is. Sophie nodded. This is a good stage. When we went outside, the evening was calm and cool. We walked slowly to her car. Thanks for dinner, Nick. Thank you for agreeing to do this. She paused by the car for a second, as if she was waiting for something. Can we do this again sometime? She asked, playing with her keys. Sure. Sophie came closer, hugged me lightly, and whispered. See you then. I watched her get into the car and drive away, leaving a light trail of headlights on the road. When I got home, Max was waiting at the door, his tail wagging. So, how was the evening? I asked, as if he could answer. Max barked and laid down on the rug. I smiled and realized that it was the beginning of something new. And this time I was ready for it. The next few weeks flew by. Sophie often came into the studio with coffee, sometimes staying to paint in the corner while I worked on the wood. Her presence no longer seemed unusual, on the contrary, I noticed that I had grown accustomed to her as well as to Max, who was now constantly hanging around. One Sunday I was nailing a new shelf in the studio when Sophie came in with a huge roll of canvas. What's this? I asked, drying my hands on a towel. It's for us. I've been wanting to paint a picture for your studio for a long time. She put the roll on the floor and began to unroll it. Really? You let me turn this place into something special for a while. I sat down next to her and saw the sketch, a view of our city from the lake, with the workshop in the foreground. Sophie. It's incredible. It's not ready yet, she laughed, but it will be. I helped her fix the canvas on the wall, and she started painting right there in the studio while I finished my work. In the evenings, we walked by the lake with Max. One day Sophie took my hand as we walked along the path and stayed for a second. "Nick, do you like it here?" "Of course I do. This is my place." She nodded as if to confirm her thoughts. "I feel at home here, too." I squeezed her fingers. "That's because you are part of this place." She stopped and looked at me like she had never looked at me before. "And you are part of mine." We stood on the shore, listening to the silence of the evening, and I realized that I no longer felt the emptiness that I once did. One day, Emma organized a small celebration for the locals, a fair with coffee and homemade pastries. Sophie was invited to exhibit some of her paintings. When we arrived at the square, Tom came up to us and laughed. "You two are always together now, aren't you?" I put my arm around Sophie's shoulders. "I guess so." Tom winked at Sophie. "Well, Nick was always in good hands. You already know that." Sophie laughed. "I'm still learning." Max ran off to join the children playing nearby, and we stayed among the people laughing and talking. It was an ordinary day, but I felt like there was something more to it. As we walked home, Sophie held my hand tighter than usual. "Nick. Are you really okay the way you are?" "Yeah." She smiled and leaned against me. "Then I'll leave it at that." I didn't mind. Autumn was turning golden, and our life in this small town seemed perfect. Sophie often stayed at my place overnight, and I got used to waking up to her footsteps in the kitchen or the sound of her brush as she painted in the morning. One evening we were sitting on the porch when Sophie suddenly said, "You know, I think it's time to buy something of our own." I looked away from Max, who was dozing lazily at my feet. "You mean a house?" She nodded. "Yeah. I love your place, but I think we need a space together. Somewhere where we can start from scratch." I thought about what she said. "Do you want something specific?" Sophie looked up and smiled. "Do you remember that old farm by the lake?" I laughed. "Really? It's a dilapidated building. But it has potential," Sophie said with a twinkle in her eye. "The farm needs a lot of work. And you're a jack of all trades," she winked. I sighed, but in my heart I knew I had already agreed. "All right, then. We'll go there tomorrow and see." The next day we did go to that farm. The house stood on a hill overlooking the lake. Its roof had partially collapsed, and the old veranda was shaking under our feet. Sophie stood in the yard, looking into the distance. "Imagine what it will be like here in the spring, when everything is in full bloom." I hugged her from behind. "Do you really want to do this?" "Yes, I do." A week later, we signed the documents. I officially became a co-owner of the dilapidated farm. When we first entered the place as owners, Max immediately ran to explore the territory, as if he felt that it was his home now. "I believe we can start something new here," Sophie said as we looked at the house from the inside. I looked at her and realized she was right. The renovation would take time, but this was our place. A place where we would create a new home, together. Winter came faster than we expected. The farm stood under a thin layer of snow, as if covered with a white blanket. Max was running around the yard, leaving chaotic footprints, and Sophie and I stood on the old veranda, looking around the house. "We'll have to start with the roof," I said, glancing at the crooked line of shingles, "otherwise this house might just be gone by spring." Sophie shook the snow off the railing and looked at me. "I know. But look at the beauty around here. Isn't it worth it?" I smiled, hugged her and kissed the top of her head. It was. We worked together every weekend, in the evenings after my work in the studio. Sophie would draw sketches of the future rooms, and I would patch holes in the walls and floor. Tom helped with the roof, and one evening, as we sat around the table eating dinner in the half-empty house, he said, "Nick, I don't know what it is with you and Sophie, but she's made you a different person. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?" "That's right," Tom raised his wine glass and winked, "a house is not a home yet. But you two are on the right track." I glanced over at Sophie. She was laughing at Max, who was trying to get a roll of twine out of her bag. Tom was right. Spring brought with it a new breath of fresh air. We finished the major work and the farm began to change. Sophie planted flowers by the windows and I finally finished the big dining room table where we could have friends over. One evening, as we were eating dinner on the veranda, Sophie said, "I think I'm ready to open my gallery." I looked up from my plate. "Are you?" "Yes. But here, on the farm. We have enough space to turn part of the house into a studio and an exhibition hall." I thought about it and nodded. "That's a great idea." Sophie squeezed my hand. "I want us to build it together." Summer came quickly. The farm became a real home. Locals came to Sophie's gallery to admire her paintings, and I received orders for furniture. One evening, when we were sitting on the porch together, Sophie said, "Do you remember the first time we met at Emma's bakery?" I said, "Of course." At the time, I thought it would just be a short conversation. But now we're here. I hugged her and looked at the sunset over the lake. Yes, we are here. And I wouldn't trade it for anything. Max lay quietly at our feet, and the wind swayed the leaves of the trees slightly. The farm gradually came to life with us. Sunny mornings began with the smell of coffee that Sophie was making before dawn, and evenings ended in the workshop where I was finishing new furniture for our home. The gallery has already started receiving visitors. Sophie organized a small exhibition right on the veranda. The paintings were between clay flower pots, and locals came to look at her work with interest. "You're really changing this place," I said one evening when we were cleaning up after the exhibition. Sophie paused for a second, looking at her paintings, and answered quietly, "We are." One day, Emma came in with a pie that smelled like apples and cinnamon. "This is for your housewarming," she said, putting the pie on the table. "We've been here for a few months now," I laughed. "And now it's official," Emma replied, winking at Sophie. We sat down on the veranda together and talked for a long time while Max hovered around the table, hoping to get a piece of the pie. "I'm happy for you," Emma said as she was about to leave. "This place was waiting for you too." Sophie held her hand. "Thank you, Emma. It wouldn't have happened without you." "You did it all by yourself," she replied, and disappeared through the gate. As the summer wore on, I noticed that Sophie was becoming thoughtful. One evening, while I was working in the studio, she came to me with a cup of tea and sat down on the bench. I asked her what was wrong. She was silent for a while and then answered, "I thought we should go away for a few days. Maybe to the sea or to the mountains. Do you want to relax?" Sophie nodded. "Yes. It would be good for us." I put my arm around her shoulders. "Then let's pick a place and go." A week later we were in a small house by the sea. Sophie sat on the shore, drawing the horizon line, and I played with Max, throwing a stick into the water. In the evenings, we sat on the terrace listening to the sound of the waves and laughing at the stupid things. We both needed this trip. When we returned home, the farm greeted us with silence and the smell of rain. "Home," Sophie said as we got out of the car. "Home," I repeated, looking at our house. Max was the first to run into the yard, as if to confirm that we were back where we felt best. We stood holding hands, looking at the farm, which was now more than just a home. It was the place where our story began. Autumn enveloped the farm in a golden haze, and Sophie and I threw ourselves into new projects. The gallery was slowly gaining popularity. Sophie held master classes for local children, and every Saturday the yard was filled with laughter and splashes of paint. Max, as always, hung around, stealing brushes and chasing birds. One evening, we were sitting on the veranda when Sophie opened her sketchbook with new sketches. "I'm thinking of creating a series of paintings about our city," she said, showing me the sketches. In one of them I recognized Emma's bakery, and in another I saw our lake with a farm on the horizon. "It's a good idea," I said, looking at the drawings, "the town will love it. I want these paintings to be part of our farm. To exhibit them in a gallery. So that people can feel this place the way we do." I nodded, the idea seemed right. Later that week, I received an unusual order. An old neighbor asked me to make a large dining room table for his family. "The family will soon get together for the first time in several years," he said, standing outside my workshop. "I want it to be a table we will sit at for years." I set to work with special inspiration. When the table was ready, Sophie helped me to paint it and carve the edges. "I think he'll be pleased," she said when we were done. I looked at her and caught myself thinking that this was more than just a job. We were creating something important together. Sunday night we sat on the porch steps, watching Max run around the yard. "Nick," Sophie said, leaning on my shoulder, "did you ever think we'd be here?" "Honestly? No. But now I can't imagine any other life." She smiled and touched my face. "I'm glad I stayed here with you." We watched in silence as the sun set over the lake. It was another ordinary evening at the farm, but there was something special about it. The simplicity of the moment, the comfort of home, and the presence of the person I loved. And that was enough. Autumn gradually turned into winter, and every day the farm became more and more like a real home. Sophie was finishing up a series of paintings about the city, and I was doing minor repairs in the yard, preparing the house for the cold. One morning, as I was shoveling the first snow from the driveway, Sophie came out onto the porch wrapped in a blanket. "How about the Christmas market?" she asked, warming her hands on a cup of tea. I lifted my head and looked at her. "What do you mean?" "The town isn't planning anything this year. Tom said that because of the lack of people, they cancelled the organization." "And you want to fix it?" Sophie smiled the way she always did when she was thinking of something big. "Why not? We have the space, and I'm sure everyone will support the idea." I sighed, but in my heart I already agreed. "All right, then. I'll talk to Tom and Emma." By the end of the week, everything was decided. The farm was the place where the Christmas market would be held. Tom and I put together small wooden houses where the locals could sell baked goods, crafts, and hot drinks. Emma started organizing the candy tables, while Sophie drew posters and decorated the farm with garlands and Christmas branches. Max ran among us, chasing snowflakes and wagging his tail as if he understood the importance of the event. The evening of the fair was magical. The snow was falling quietly from the sky, and the square in front of the farm was filled with people. Children were playing by the Christmas tree, adults were drinking hot chocolate, and the lights of the garlands twinkled against the old house. Sophie stood next to me, holding my hand. "Look," she said, pointing to the family sitting at the large table I had made a few months ago, "this is your work." I looked and saw 3 generations gathered at that table. They looked happy. Sophie smiled. "Because this place is a part of it all." I hugged her, breathing in the cool air. "Sophie, and so are you." Max barked, drawing our attention again. "I think he's saying it's time to rest," Sophie laughed. We went inside the house, leaving the guests to celebrate in the yard. At that moment I realized that I was no longer looking for answers to the questions that had once tormented me. The farm had become our home, and Sophie was the person I couldn't imagine my life without. The next morning, the farm plunged into silence. The snow continued to fall quietly, covering the yard like a blanket. Max was lying lazily by the fireplace, looking at Sophie and me sitting at the table with cups of hot coffee. "It looks like the city will be pleased with the fair," she said, leaning back. I looked out the window, where I could still see the footprints of yesterday's visitors. "Yes. It was nice to see the farm come alive. Sophie propped her head on her hand and looked at me thoughtfully. "And how are you? Do you feel at home?" I held her eyes for a second. "With you?" "Yes." She smiled and reached out her hand, touching my palm. "I'm glad." We sat in silence for a while longer, while the wood and the fireplace crackled in the room. As the days passed, the farm became more and more a part of our lives. I started working on a large order for tables and benches for a local cafe. Sophie was working on paintings for the upcoming spring exhibition. Every morning we would go for a walk by the lake, Max always running in front, and Sophie and I would follow, holding hands. One day during this walk, Sophie suddenly stopped and said, "I've been thinking of another idea." "I'm listening," I replied, stopping next to her. "Maybe we could make a small guest house here on the farm. For those who want to stay in nature." I looked at her with interest. "You want to open a farm for tourists?" "Why not? This place has its own atmosphere. People would love it." I thought about it. "It sounds like a good idea. We could start small." She smiled, and I saw that familiar twinkle in her eye when she's on fire with an idea. "Then after the holidays we'll start planning." Spring came quickly. We worked on the guest house, and Sophie prepared a new exhibition of her paintings at the same time. There were a lot of people at the gallery opening. Sophie walked among the guests, talking about the paintings, and I stood back, watching her shine in the spotlight. Emma came up to me and nodded at Sophie. "She's really happy, Nick. And so are you." I looked at her and smiled. "Yes, she is." Emma pushed me lightly in the side. "Emma, well, don't delay. Give it to her officially." I looked at Sophie, who met my gaze and winked. "Maybe I will." That evening, when the guests left, Sophie and I sat on the veranda, wrapping blankets around our shoulders. "You did it," I said, looking at the gallery lights. "It's because of you," she replied, leaning toward me. I lightly took a small box out of my pocket and placed it on the table between us. Sophie looked at me in surprise. "What is this?" "A present." She opened the box and froze. It was a simple silver ring. "Nick." I took her hand. "We're already building a home together, why not build the rest of our lives together?" Sophie was silent for a second, then laughed through her tears and whispered softly, "Yes." Max lifted his head, looking at us curiously, and then lay down at our feet again. The farm was now more than just a home. It was the place where our story together began. After that night, the farm seemed to change. Sophie and I woke up earlier, worked longer hours, and dreamed bigger. The guest house we were building no longer felt like just a part of the business, it was a place we were creating with the idea of a future that would become even stronger. One morning I walked into the studio and saw Sophie at her canvas. She was painting intently, but stopped when I walked in. "You're early today," she said, looking up. "I wanted to finish a couple of orders," I replied, taking off my jacket. "What are you doing here at 6 in the morning?" Sophie smiled slightly. "I'm painting our farm." I came closer and saw the painting, the house, the yard, Max lying by the door. Everything looked even more cozy on the canvas than in reality. "It's beautiful. This is our home, Nick." I kissed her on the cheek, and we stood there for a few minutes looking at the painting. In the spring, the guest house was ready. Sophie arranged the inside of it herself, simple furniture, paintings on the walls, a wooden table that I made myself. "People will feel at home here," she said when we were done. "Or like in an art gallery," I joked, looking at the number of her paintings. She nudged me in the side. "I just want this place to have a soul." The first guests arrived in early summer. A young couple from the city wanted to spend a weekend in nature. Max immediately became their guide, leading them around the farm. In the evening, Sophie and I sat on the porch watching the couple walk by the lake. "Do you remember the first time we walked here?" Sophie asked, leaning against me. "I do. And I don't want to forget." She took my hand and squeezed it tightly. We were on the right track. I kissed her hair and answered, "I'm sure of it." The summer flew by quickly, but it left many memories. In August, we organized a small festival on the farm. Locals brought their crafts, and I made an improvised workshop for children. Sophie held painting workshops right on the veranda. Emma brought her apple pie again and said, "This time I made two, one for you and one for the guests." Tom jokingly added, "If you keep up the good work, your place will be the main attraction in town." Sophie smiled and looked at me. "The main thing is that it is a place where we are happy." Autumn brought peace again. The festival was a success, and the farm was filled with memories of the summer. Couples and families now often stayed in the guest house, and Sophie and I received more and more orders for furniture and paintings. One morning, while I was working in the studio, Sophie came in with a cup of coffee and a mysterious smile. "I have an idea," she said, sitting down on the bench by the door. "Another one?" I raised an eyebrow, laughing. "Yes. What if we set up a little coffee shop right here on the farm? On weekends, people could come, walk around, sit in the yard and enjoy nature." I put down the hammer and thought about it. "It sounds good. But we need someone to take care of the kitchen." Sophie raised her finger. "I've already spoken to Emma. She's willing to supply us with baked goods." "You've got it all planned out, right?" She smiled. "Well, almost. I knew you wouldn't say no." We started small, with tables in the yard and a coffee machine in an old barn. Sophie decorated the place with flowers, and I made wooden benches and a small terrace. When everything was ready, Emma brought the first batch of pastries and the farm officially opened its doors to guests as an open-air coffee shop. One day, when I was serving coffee to an elderly couple, Sophie came over and whispered, "Look at this." I looked up and saw several families gathered at the gate. The children were playing with Max, and the parents were talking at the tables. "They must like it here," I said, putting my cup on the tray. "They feel like this place has a soul," Sophie replied, putting her arms around my waist. The day ended and we were left sitting by the lake. "Do you think this is just the beginning?" Sophie asked, looking at the moon's reflection on the water. "I think so. And I don't mind if this beginning lasts as long as possible." She smiled and squeezed my hand tighter. Max lay down next to me and fell asleep quietly, tired after a long day. We sat listening to the silence of the night. The farm was no longer just our home. It became a place that united the people around us. Winter came unexpectedly, covering the farm with a white blanket. The outdoor coffee shop temporarily closed, but that didn't stop us. Sophie suggested that we set up a small room inside the old barn where we used to store our tools. "It will be warm and cozy," she said, looking around the space. "People can drink coffee by the fireplace, and you can sell your furniture right from the workshop." I looked at the old wooden beams and imagined what this place could look like. "It's a lot of work, but it's possible." "I'll help," Sophie said, taking a hammer from the shelf. Over the next month, we transformed the barn together. I made tables out of thick oak planks, and Sophie painted the walls with large paintings of winter landscapes. Emma brought her pies and helped us set up the kitchen. By mid-December, the new coffee shop was ready. We lit the fireplace, decorated the space with garlands and invited all our friends and neighbors to the opening. In the evening, when the first guests started to arrive, Tom brought along some musicians he knew. "I thought a little live music would be nice," he said as he set up his instruments in the corner. Sophie just smiled. "You're a genius, Tom." Max laid down by the fireplace and lazily watched all the fuss. The guests sat at the tables, drinking hot cider, laughing and talking about how the town had changed over the past year. When the music died down, Sophie came to the center of the room with a cup of coffee and said quietly, "Thank you for being here today. This farm is not just a home for Nick and me. It is a place where we are creating something important. And we are happy that you are a part of it." The people applauded and I hugged Sophie, feeling warmth spreading inside me. Late at night, when the last guests had left, Sophie and I were alone in the empty hall. "It was perfect," she said, watching the last sparks go out in the fireplace. "And it's only the beginning," I replied, holding her hand. Max raised his head as if to agree with every word. We sat there together, listening to the wind outside the window gently swaying the branches of the trees. This winter was special. For the first time in a long time, I felt like everything was in its place. And I had Sophie by my side, the woman who became my family. The winter dragged on, and the snow covered the farm with an even thicker layer. The coffee shop in the barn was open every weekend, bringing together friends and locals who fled the cold to the warm fireplace. Sophie spent more time there than she did at home, transforming the space into a place for creativity. One evening, as I was finishing the last table in the studio, she walked in and stopped at the door. "We have a new client," she said, leaning against the door frame. "Who is it this time?" "Marta. She wants you to make a bed for her." I looked up and smiled. "Oh, Martha." I joked that she was sleeping on the same old couch from the 90s. Sophie laughed. "Now she'll have something made of oak." For the next few weeks I worked on this order. Sophie continued to paint, most of them inspired by our life on the farm, snowy trees, windows with twinkling lights, and Max's silhouette, which was always a part of her work. One afternoon, as I was finishing sanding the headboard for the bed, Sophie came in with a strange look on her face. I asked her what was wrong. She was silent for a moment and then said, "I have some news." "Is it good or bad?" "It depends on how you look at it." I put down my tools and came closer. "Sophie, what is it?" She pulled an envelope out of her pocket and handed it to me. I received an offer to exhibit my work in a gallery in the city. I looked at her, trying to understand what she was feeling. "This is great. Why do you look like you're in doubt?" Sophie shrugged her shoulders. "It's just for a few months. They want me to move there for a season, organize an exhibition and stay for a few workshops." Now I understood why she was so tense. "And you're not sure if you want to go?" "Yes." I took her hands in mine and looked into her eyes. "Sophie, you have to go. This is your opportunity." She was a little embarrassed, but I could see the same light in her eyes. "Are you sure about this?" "Absolutely. I can handle Max here." She squeezed my hands tighter and leaned her forehead against mine. "Thank you, Nick." After she left, the farm seemed a little quieter than usual. Max sometimes sat by the door waiting for Sophie to come back. So did I. We often talked on the phone in the evening, and I could see how happy she was there, among the artists and exhibitions. One day Sophie sent me a photo of her standing in the gallery next to her paintings, and I realized that she was in her place. 3 months later, I was picking her up from the train station. Sophie got off the train with a suitcase in one hand and a painting in the other. "What is it?" I asked, throwing the suitcase into the car. She unfolded the painting. It was our farm, bathed in warm evening light. I painted it every time I thought about home. I hugged her and held her close. "This is the best painting you've ever done." Sophie smiled and whispered, "Because it's about us." We got in the car and drove home. The farm was waiting for us. Spring came to the farm with Sophie. The snow gradually melted, and the first greenery appeared underneath. The farm came to life, the guest house became a place for vacationers again, and Sophie and I took on a new project, expanding the coffee shop. "If this summer is as crowded as last summer," Sophie said, drawing sketches on an old table in the workshop, we'll need more space. I agree. It's time to add a few more tables on the terrace. Max was lying under the table listening intently, as if he were part of our plans. I still can't believe your gallery was such a success, I said, recalling her exhibition in the city. Sophie shrugged, a little embarrassed. It was a good experience. But I feel at home here. I looked at her and realized that she wasn't just saying that. In the spring, there was a lot of work on the farm. I was building new tables and benches for the guests, and Sophie was gardening, planting flowers and ornamental shrubs around the guest house. Emma, as always, helped with the baking, and Tom sometimes came by to help with the heavier work. This place isn't just a farm anymore, he said one day as we were installing a new archway with garlands at the entrance. I smiled, drying my hands on a towel. Maybe this is our little world. Tom nodded. And people like it. One evening, as Sophie and I sat on the terrace, she said thoughtfully, I think I'm ready for another exhibition. Tom, really? Yes. But this time I want some of the paintings to be about our life here. I looked at her and smiled. I think it's a great idea. She took my hand. And I want you to make furniture for this exhibition. Furniture? Yes. I want your chairs and tables in the hall. You are an artist, even if you don't want to admit it. I laughed. Okay, you got it. When summer came into its own, the exhibition was ready. Sophie worked on the paintings until late at night, and I built tables and frames for her paintings. The opening was scheduled for mid-June. On the day of the exhibition, we went to the city with Max, who was now almost the official mascot of all our trips. The evening was perfect. People came into the gallery, stopped at Sophie's paintings, sat at my tables and praised every detail. It's a real success, said Emma, who had come to support us. I looked at Sophie talking to the guests and realized that this was another important step for both of us. When the evening was over, the two of us stood at the exit, looking out at the empty hall. Thank you, Nick, Sophie said, squeezing my hand. For what? For always being there for me. I hugged her, and we stood in silence, listening to the city gradually sink into silence. Our life on the farm did not look like a traditional one. But it was real. And that's what made it special. Summer brought not only heat but also new opportunities. After the exhibition, Sophie received several invitations to workshops in neighboring cities. At first she was hesitant to go, but I pushed her. This is your time. Don't be afraid to open up new horizons. But the farm? The farm is not going anywhere. Max and I will manage. Sophie smiled and kissed me. Then promise me you won't turn it into a studio with furniture instead of flowers. No promises, I winked. While Sophie spent a week in the city, I immersed myself in work on the farm. From morning to evening, I made new benches for the yard, tended the garden, and took care of Max, who didn't give me a moment's peace. In the evening, he and I sat on the porch and watched the sunset. Do you think Sophie is having fun? I asked, as if Max could answer. He just barked and lay down with his head in my lap. The silence on the farm was strange. A week later, Sophie returned. She appeared in the yard late in the afternoon when I was watering the flowers. Hi, she said, standing by the car with a suitcase in her hands. Hi, I wiped my hands on a towel and walked over to her. How was it? It was great, but I missed home. I took her suitcase and brought it inside. Max did too. He hadn't left the door all week. Max ran up to Sophie, started jumping, and she bent down to hug him. I'm glad to be home. We ate dinner on the terrace, as usual. Sophie talked about the city, new friends, and plans for the fall. By the way, I thought of one thing, she said, putting down her cup. What is it? We could organize a small art festival here at the farm. Bring together artists, craftsmen, local producers. I thought about it for a second. It sounds interesting. But it's a lot of work. We have time. And I'm sure it will be a good event for the whole town. I looked at her and realized that the decision had already been made. All right, then. Let's do it. Sophie lit up with joy. You'll see, it will be something special. We spent the next few months working on the festival. Tom helped set up the stage for the musicians, and Emma promised to organize a food area. Sophie invited artists from neighboring towns, and I took care of the venue and furniture for the guests. When the day of the festival came, the farm looked like a living painting. Brightly colored canvases were everywhere, the aromas of coffee and pastries mingled with the music, and children ran between the tables holding balls. Sophie stood at the entrance, greeting the guests, and I watched from the workshop, grateful for how our lives had changed. In the evening, when the last guests left, we sat on the veranda with glasses of wine. How did you do it? I asked, looking at her with pride. I just believed in us, she answered quietly, holding my hand. Max lay down at our feet again, closing his eyes. And at that moment I realized that we had truly found our place. We didn't need anything else. Summer flowed smoothly into autumn, and the farm plunged back into tranquility. After the art festival, the town began to look at the farm in a new way. People often stopped by for coffee, to buy furniture, or just to walk around the yard, breathing in the smell of fresh wood and paint. One morning, while I was fixing the fence at the entrance, Sophie came out of the house wrapped in a warm sweater. "We have a guest," she said, pointing to the path. I turned around and saw Tom. He was walking toward us with a heavy file under his arm. "You two are becoming a real local legend," Tom laughed as he approached. "What is it this time?" I wiped my hands and sat down on the porch steps. Tom put the folder on the table. "Do you remember the old barn by the woods that's been sitting empty? The city council decided to tear it down, but I thought, what do you want us to do with it?" Sophie caught his eye. Tom held up his hands. "Not necessarily. But if anyone can make it into something worthwhile, it's you." I opened the folder. There were blueprints and old photos of the barn. "It's a challenge," I said quietly. "But don't you love a challenge?" Tom winked. Sophie looked at me, her eyes shining with interest. "Let's at least look at it," she whispered. I sighed, already knowing the answer was yes. "Okay, Tom. We'll go there tomorrow." Tom smiled and waved goodbye. I knew I could count on you. The next day we went to the barn. The building was dilapidated, but it had its own charm. "Look at this place," Sophie said, holding my hand, "we could do something special here." I looked at the old barn and imagined what it would look like after renovation. "If we do it, we'll do it together." Sophie smiled. As always. Max was running nearby, and I stood next to Sophie, breathing in the crisp autumn air. This project would not be easy, but I felt it would be another important part of our story. Work on the barn lasted until late fall. Every day, Sophie and I would return there after work on the farm and stay until dusk, repairing the walls, strengthening the beams, and adding new windows to let light in. Tom and Emma used to come by often, bringing hot tea and homemade cakes. "You two have turned this place into something special," Emma said one evening as we were finishing the new front door. "It's just a barn for now," I replied, wiping my hands. "But I see more." Sophie came closer and hugged me. Tom winked. "Sometimes old places are just waiting for the right people." By winter, we finished the main work. The barn looked like a miniature gallery with large windows that overlooked the forest. Locals started coming here just like they did to the farm, first out of curiosity, and then just for the atmosphere. One evening, when we were finishing decorating the building for the holidays, Sophie said quietly, "Nick, I think this is the last puzzle." I looked at her, not understanding. "The last puzzle?" She turned to me, and I saw peace in her eyes. Now everything is in its place. The farm, the gallery, the barn. And us. I squeezed her hand and realized that she was right. We had come a long way from where we started. On Christmas Eve, we opened the barn to everyone. The light from the garlands shimmered through the large windows, and the fire in the fireplace kept everyone warm. Tom was playing guitar, Emma was pouring hot cider, and Max was running around getting treats. Sophie stood next to me, watching it all. "We did it," she said quietly, leaning against my shoulder. I hugged her, breathing in the smell of winter and wood that still smelled of fresh varnish. Yes, we made it. We stood at the entrance, watching how our lives had transformed the old barn into a place full of warmth and light. Max lay down at our feet, and the snow fell quietly outside the window. I knew there was still much to come. But in this moment, everything was as it should be. When the last guest left the barn, we were left alone. Max lay down by the fireplace, curled up contentedly. Sophie stood by the large window, watching the snow slowly fall on the farm. I walked over and hugged her from behind, breathing in the familiar smell of her hair. "What do you think?" I asked quietly. "That I'm happy," she replied, not taking her eyes off the snowy yard. I kissed her temple and leaned my forehead lightly against her shoulder. I wanted to do the same. We stood in silence, listening to the wood crackling in the fireplace. No close-ups, no unnecessary words. Just us.